All right. I think we're recording.
Okay.
Hey, how you doing?
Wonderful. All right. There are more people which are in. Okay. Yeah, for 1 minute. Will John and I do get back, and then we will
Get going.
Great visuals.
What?
Great visuals.
Yes. Yeah.
It was the laziest slide I've ever put together.
All right. Well, I think that we should get things going. So welcome to the first ever undergraduate symposium at the Ostrom Workshop.
Yay.
This is really exciting. We have sort of 3 different groups who have been supported in some way by the Ostrom Workshop. So we're going to showcase all the wonderful work that they've been doing and any reflections they've had on sort of what it means to do undergraduate research. So we have one from a layered learning project between that me and Natasha got to support 3 undergraduates to look at plastics in river systems. We have another group that John led. That's the Consumer Sustainability Report group that comes out of a class that he's teaching. That's John Eldon. He's a affiliate of the workshop and faculty over at Neil. And then we have a third group that was sponsored and supported by Jesse O'Reilly, who's in HLS, who takes students to the Conference of the Parties climate negotiations every year. And some of the students that joined her will be talking about what they learned and the research that they conducted as a result of either their trip there or their reflections. Before we really get going, I first want to say thank you to undergraduates for your participation, for all your hard work. That really is really wonderful and gratifying on the part of faculty. To see all of the things that have come out of our work together. Also really want to thank Natasha for having this idea and organizing it.
So excited.
Thank you very much. And then also our staff members who are not here right now, but Kirsten and Karen and Anna, who will be helping us make sure that we have cookies shortly, very important. And then after the fact, we'll have some pizza and a brief little reception.
Oh.
Yeah. We don't do anything here without food.
3, you just came in, get some coffee as well.
Yes. So without further ado, I think we're gonna get started just really briefly. Folks will present a little bit on their work and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions and reflections and discussions of what you all accomplished. And then we'll have a brief break and then we'll go to the next group. Okay, and I believe we're leading with the plastics and the rivers group, and then we'll be doing consumer sustainability, I think is next, and then the COP.
The COP people are.
Oh, COP people a second. Okay, awesome, great, sorry. All right, without further ado, first group. Give a bit overview of what is it we do.
I'll introduce our project and then go over our RRAs will dig into it with us. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. I want to start by introducing RRAs and then we'll kind of tuck into all of the work. And this project that I'm so excited about sprung from some conversations that Jess and I were having about waste and visibility and source to sea plastics pollution, marine system mitigation from the accumulation there. And then, like as Jess said, we were really, really lucky to win this HLS Layered Learning Grant, which let us hire our fab RAs. And yeah, so I just want to say that one of the things that I've personally really, really enjoyed about this is our RAs come from very different research backgrounds. And I love the way that all of their minds work so differently. And so they engage with this exact same material and come up with these very different solutions, very different ideas. And it's been fabulous. It feels so Ostromian to me, the way that we collaborate. And it's been such a it's not like a top-down project at all. This has been extremely iterative amongst all of us. And so the product that we've put together has been so benefited by these 3 people. And then I'll actually talk about what we are doing now. So we're investigating the mechanisms that allow macroplastics pollution to leak into riverine systems that ultimately flow into the ocean. So that's sort of the source to sea framework. But a traditional source to sea framework starts with the riverine basin. And we tried to zoom out a little bit more to understand the supply chain that makes this problem, like creates the material conditions and the gaps that we're going to discuss later to be able to pinpoint different pockets where interventions would be useful. So one of the things about source to sea plastics pollution is by the time it's in the ocean, it's almost impossible to effectively recover. And so the best solutions are mitigating solutions or intercepting solutions before it gets there. And so that's kind of what we've been looking at, but specifically our case study is the Ozama River in the Dominican Republic. So yeah, to analyze this very complex network of decoupled systems, RRAs have really dived into the core pillars of the IAD framework, which is what we've used to analyze the different gaps. So Lewis has been looking at the material conditions and the physical geography of the basin. Aaron has been focusing on the sociocultural attributes of the community, and Avi has been working on evaluating the formal and informal rules that are in place for waste management. And so, yeah, I will now hand it over to Lewis, who's going to open up for us.
Thank you so much. So I'm Lewis. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to talk about riverine plastic pollution and more specifically how the material conditions of the Ozama River impact how plastics enter the river. So we're just gonna quickly go over some of the specific material conditions that we are analyzing. First, like the most obvious thing is like the geography and the hydrology of the river. So things like the length of the river, how many tributaries the river has, and that obviously just impacts the amount of plastics that can enter the river. And then there's things like climate and extreme weather events. This is really important, specifically with extreme weather events, because in many places around the world, not just the Dominican Republic, communities place their waste sites along the coasts of the ocean or along river shores so that when these extreme weather events happen, the flooding actually kind of disposes of the waste on its own and disposes of it into the river and the ocean with, of course, like at the expense of the river systems, of course. And if you could go slide real quick. So next, the level of urbanization is super, super important. I created this crude little map in ArcGIS.
It's not crude at all. That's so cool.
To kind of give you a better demonstration of that. So the blue lines, that's just the Ozama River system and all of its tributaries. And then the red to yellow gradient, that's population density. So the red is a higher population density and the yellow is a lower population density. And basically what you can see in this map is that the vast majority of the population is actually concentrated basically right at the mouth of the river and right along the coast. And from this, we can kind of hypothesize that vast majority of the plastics as well are entering not anywhere really in the north, in the mountains and rainforest, but really just in the urban area of Santo Domingo itself. And that was actually luckily confirmed by a recent Dominican study, which basically confirmed that the vast majority of plastics are actually entering almost immediately before ocean. This one. And then lastly, just the infrastructure in general has a really big impact on this as well, specifically the waste infrastructure. So specifically Santo Domingo, they have a really big problem with waste infrastructure accessibility. So only 75% of the city's population actually has access to their compactor trucks. And so that means that there's a whole subset of the population that really can't actually access a proper way to dispose of their waste, which we'll get into a little bit more in the future presentations. And just as a general reflection on the research process, some of the methodologies that were used, obviously a lot of analysis of secondary sources because we're not able to be there in person ourselves, unfortunately. But also it was really great to be able to use a lot of mapping tools and visualizations. Even when I was doing the research itself, I kind of underestimated how helpful these visualizations would be to the research process and not only to just explain to the audience, but like it actually really helped me like further my own thought process with the research. And then one of the main kind of issues that I ran into was how to manage certain like knowledge and literature gaps in regards to this. Just because the Ozama River, it isn't a particularly like well studied river in regards to pollution. So there's a lot of missing literature. Like I'd be pulling on a certain thread, and then eventually it would get to a point where it would be difficult to figure out kind of where to go from there. And kind of in addition to that, figuring out what's exactly relevant to to the issue itself. So, for example, I spent a lot of time looking at saline intrusion and UV radiation, and eventually got to a point where I had to ask myself, is that sort of information actually impacting the broader picture enough to continue down this path, I guess. And that is all I got. I'll pass it on to my research partners. Thank you guys so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Schmeltz. I'm a senior studying international studies in Spanish with minors in Latin American and Caribbean studies and biology. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you guys about my portion of the research that I've been working on with this project. And so I specifically looked at how do attributes of the community contribute to the macroplastic pollution problem of the Ozama River. And so this is kind of how I went about my research. I investigated the socioeconomic, cultural, and behavioral conditions of communities living along the Ozama River basin, and I really relied on primary sources, specifically newspaper articles written in Spanish and published by sources in the Dominican Republic, and also secondary sources like journal articles written by regional experts in the Caribbean. So this is what I found. From this research, I really wanted to grasp like what was the public perception of the river and how do these communities interact with the river in their daily lives, or whether they do or they don't. So I found that there are two distinct communities of people both living in the Brado Santo Domingo area whose socioeconomic, cultural, and behavioral conditions impact the macroplastic pollution. There are these informal settlements, which are communities of like historically displaced and vulnerable populations who are displaced from the city center, forced out of the city center during like rapid urbanization processes, who cannot afford to live there, and they were pushed to the river edge of the Ozama River. And so like imagine very impoverished communities, no infrastructure, like in one place, if there were extreme weather events like flooding or landslides, everything, all of the property of these communities would be swept into the river. And then conversely, there are communities who were living in like this urban city center where there's a lot more infrastructure and state services. And so what I found is that both of these communities similarly contribute to the macroplastic pollution problem of the river basin, because like Lewis said, there's such a widespread systemic lack of solid waste management infrastructure. So because packaging, plastic packaging specifically, is so prevalent in the economy of the Dominican Republic, like most goods are packaged using this plastic packaging, that waste inevitably ends up in these communities. And because there's no solid waste management infrastructure, this waste then ends up in the Ozama River. And so I also looked into like the implications of this plastic pollution on the Dominican Republic economy, specifically their tourism and fishing industry. Tourism wise, it's like people go to the Dominican Republic for their beaches and things like that. And so tourists wouldn't want to lay on a beach if there's a large swath of macroplastics coming in and polluting the shores. And then related to the fishing industry, macroplastic pollution degrades habitats, specifically I looked into an article related to the mahi fish industry, and that has really big implications for like the little remaining artisanal fishermen that remain in that in the Dominican fishing industry. And so what did I learn? Research is an iterative process, like what Natasha said. And it was really cool to see how our sections were really interconnected. Like every time we came to our meetings, it was like, I didn't really know what information I read was actually going to be important until we discussed it together. And being able to hear from both Louis and Avi's backgrounds, like how we each thought about different things. It was really cool. And then the major gap I found in this research is that ethnographic studies could be really useful. It would be really cool to like talk to people living in these informal settlements, and talking to people living in the urbanized city centers to hear about their waste management behaviors, to see how they interact with the river. And lastly, this experience has contributed to my personal, professional, and academic growth. It was really cool to collaborate with this research team and to be able to synthesize research into academic writing, and to collaborate with some really great people. So thank you.
Great.
Hey guys, my name is Avi, and my research focused on the institutional governance of macroplastics. So kind of like how I even like dug into this in the first place was I looked at Law 225-20, and what that is, it's the law that's currently established in the Dominican Republic. It was established in the Dominican Republic in 2020, and what it is, it's a law to decrease the number of plastics and just like an enforcement of more laws, like enforcement of reduction in plastic pollution overall in the DR. And there isn't any specifics within the law. It's mostly just a general policy. And that kind of ties into like what I'll talk about later with like the gaps within enforcing all these laws and policies in the DR. The second thing I want to touch on was I kind of used the UN Comrade data set to kind of quantify how much plastic is entering and leaving the Dominican Republic. And the reason I did this was I really did this to quantify and see visually and understand how big of an impact the policy gaps within the DR are having on the Ozama River itself. And then after that, I also reviewed a couple reports from organizations like the World Bank and policy reports. And I did this to really understand the current state of waste management systems within the Dominican Republic and to see how functional they actually are and whether like the systems are being actually implemented to their maximum potential. And I kind of just took all this information all at one time and kind of like, talked with my research partners and, Natasha and Professor Steinberg. And we kind of like try to understand kind of like what policies are supposed to do and like whether they're being implemented to their maximum potential. Next here, I kind of like quantified the data for you a little bit, but these are kind of like the main findings from the plastic pollution within the Ozama. And what we can kind of see is like the DR generates over 12,000 tons of waste per day, and around 15% of that waste is unmanaged. So what that means is that directly leads into leakage into like the Ozama River as one of its main waterways. And also when looking at the UN Comrade data set, I kind of found that at the same time, the country imports over $2.4 billion worth of plastics each year, and plastic packaging imports went 75% since 2015. So what this tells you is that the problem is only increasing, and it's increasing. It almost doubled within the last 10 years. So this just shows that the plastic pollution problem is pretty prominent. And one of the biggest factors are the institutional fragmentation and the policy gaps that are occurring within the Dominican Republic. And on top of that, there are limited taxes, and like the infrastructure for taxes within the Dominican Republic are very limited. And it's not a very developed system because it is a third world country, unlike the United States. So there isn't much money being put into the Dominican Republic for these waste management systems, for things like tax collection, which can go towards maintaining these like waste management systems and like creating new systems to be actually implemented in place. And we kind of could see that after like the election of the new president in 2020 of Luis Abinader. Because initially they had plans to like implement different systems in place before 2020, but since his election, he's kind of had different priorities. So kind of like my key insight and what I kind of learned from doing this research as a whole is that I initially thought that, uh, plastic pollution was mostly due to the behavior of each individual within the DR. But I kind of backed up, looked at the whole system as a whole, and kind of saw that it was more so system driven, and it was the policies that were put in place and the limited amount of infrastructure within the DR that kind of led to this problem as a whole. Um, and also like the trade data kind of like revealed like the scale of external and internal plastic inflows and kind of quantified that whole data. But what I kind of learned is that like Aaron previously touched on is like all our research is interconnected. There isn't one solution to solving plastic pollution. I know we all had different ideas, but I think we could all see that from all of our research that like it's a really big problem, and then we kind of have to piece every aspect of our research together to really solve this problem as a whole. But I guess like this really gives you a better understanding of the current state of plastic pollution in the Zama River and like the fragmentation that there does exist within the DR. So yeah, I think this whole research process I definitely do a lot. Really understood how to piece together quantitative and qualitative research, and it was a great process as a whole. Thank you.
No, guys, you did so good. All right, so we're going to turn it to discussion. You guys are free to ask them some questions about the research process if you have suggestions that are constructive for their work. And it also can be bi-directional. So if you guys want to ask the experts in the rooms things about managing the research process or like things that you think might need to be investigated further or just general, how do I become an academic questions, this is free for all for about 25 minutes. And I can keep notes of who has thoughts and keep time. Yes.
First of all, I think they are the experts in the room. They did an amazing job. That's just so wonderful to see you perform and do. I mean, I wish I had Professor Steinberg and Natasha as well. But a lot of credit to you too, of course, that you did an amazing job. I just have like a couple of questions around the project. Like, first of all, like why this particular river? Like how you chose this particular river? And what is the outcome of this project? Like in terms of are you writing a authored paper or is this turning into a policy report or something? That's kind of a larger question to the team, but individually I would ask like, I mean, I'm definitely, I'm sure you all did a great job and had amazing experiences. And as you all said, that it's an iterative process, you come and every time you go back as a different person, right? So like some of the hurdles, some of the unease, some of the discomforts that you experienced in those meetings or in those, like in the research process in general, like I would like to know that part too, because that part is not there, right? So like, and that's important part, like how you sort of navigate a challenging situation. Yeah. And thank you. It's amazing.
I can answer the first part about why we chose the Ozama River. So
Lewis is the one who targeted the Ozama for us, so he might be too modest to say that, but that's a good reason for this question.
yeah, so originally we were looking at rivers with like really transferable properties between other rivers, so kind of rivers that weren't necessarily too like insane, I guess is a good way to put it. Like they had very like common characteristics with other high plastic polluting rivers. And the Ozama River specifically stood out, one, because there's like a proximity to the US, which so there's like perspective that made it feel more relevant, I guess. do US-based research, but also it's one of the highest plastic polluting rivers in the Caribbean Sea, and so there are more stakes there. Instead of like another river that interested me was a river in Trinidad, and it would have been a really interesting river to look into, but like the research wouldn't have contributed to as much of a like a solution. Like it wouldn't have created as much of a solution, I guess. So it was a good middle river.
Does anybody want to comment on sort of the literature that we looked at that helped us narrow down key attributes? That helped us narrow down the base?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it started with listening to a podcast, and we were looking at like what are the characteristics of river basins that are shared among the most polluted rivers in the world, and we looked at like areas with very high population density, and so that also fit the Dominican Republic's Ozama River, especially because the river mouth is the city of Santo Domingo is like located at the river mouth, so that was like also another implication. I think also, yes, we picked the Ozama River for its like shared characteristics, but also for its like maybe like unique what it could bring to like the field of source to sea plastic discussion, especially because it's like an island nation, and so there's implications for that, like especially for like plastic trade. Right, like how does that plastic get in there the first place? Is it like produced on the island or imported? And like that has implications for the infrastructure or lack of infrastructure.
Yeah, so this is a really good point about dense urban areas that Lewis was presenting on a riverbank at the exit point into a marine or coastal environment. But also, what was the last thing that you said? Oh, small island states. This is also why this was so interesting to us, is small island states are more likely to have high plastic imports and rely on a sachet economy. And so you get like a higher quantity of plastics usage in these places and fewer places to dispose of it, just because of the geographic constraints of it. So yeah.
Partly I was asking that question because I thought there are like almost 2/3 of the global river are kind of shared rivers,
Yeah,
right? So I was just wondering like if this was part of the consideration that like we just.
actually it is. This is such a good point. Yes, you're so knowledgeable, but this is one of the things that we discussed was, do we need to bring in the scope a little bit rather than being like, are we now trying to analyze institutions across borders? We decided to try to stay away from transboundary in nature so that we weren't navigating both of those competing things at the same time. And then do you guys remember what was your middle question?
It's like challenges.
Was there?
There
was
was
the last
question
one?
much, and then what's the final product?
Oh, right. Yeah. Carry on.
Yeah, so our final product is we hope to produce a paper that we hope to like connect all of our ideas together, and really like maybe even generalize our study to show that like, you know, whatever challenges and like implications there are within the Ozama River, that we can learn from those challenges and really understand, you know, how to align the incentives that are currently occurring within the Ozama River, how solutions to, you know, reduce plastic inflows within the Ozama River, understand the whole infrastructure of the Ozama River. And from there, the biggest takeaways would be to anyone reading the paper would be to understand that this is a major issue that's occurring across the world, and also to understand, you know, what specific components there are to it when it comes to examining a river, examining what type of, you know, challenges there are associated with the river, and then like you know, the policy implications of it, you know, the geography implications of it, and then just combining all our parts to be able to convey to the reader that like this is a challenge and like here are the potential solutions associated with it.
To clarify, Abby was very modest there. We have actually drafted most of the paper already.
It's like 3/4 done. It's
We
very-
are sort of like
Yeah.
finalizing the introduction and conclusion discussion sections, but they've really done writing already.
Let's see.
Did anyone else have any thoughts on those struggles, things you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at the beginning, it was just like getting used to a whole new, I mean, obviously I understood the problem we were looking at, but it was really like diving deep into the literature. Like I knew nothing about like different plastic types and polymers and things like that. And like when we were looking at like trade flows with the trade data set, I mean, I felt like I just had taken really like an economics course. So I was just like a little bit in over my head, but like obviously I was able to like discern patterns, and after talking with the group, we were able to really like figure out what's actually important in this data set and how it like relates to what we are looking at. And so I feel like that was the case in a lot of instances at the beginning. Like we would read things and then like have ideas, have questions, identify gaps, identify like how what we've read relates back to what we were looking at. And it was really cool to have that discussion. And I came back sometimes a little bit more confused, but then I would go back to reading it, like actually understand it more. And then sometimes I came out of it like feeling great and being like, okay, I understand this.
It was so nice to watch it all kind of come together at the end, because they were so gracious with this being quite an amorphous project at the beginning. And then, yeah, we just found ways to sew together all of their different research areas. And yeah, it's been great.
Kind of going off of that, I'd say that my like greatest challenge was just like, how in the world am I supposed to narrow down such a project with such an enormous scope? And like, we definitely got there eventually, which I'm probably what I'm most proud of, like actually being able to condense all the different factors to one kind of cohesive product. But that was absolutely the most challenging thing for me throughout the research process.
I think this whole project as a whole was like a puzzle. Initially, like I kind of Googled like how do we reduce macroplastics pollution within the Ozama, and on Google there was no clear answer. And initially, I was kind of like annoyed, but then I think that's the most fun and most challenging part of the project, and like that's where I learned the most and was able to grow. And like I kind of like noticed that like it was like a puzzle piece. We're able to connect things together, like the Comrade data set combined with like different papers I read. I kind of got to understand the different facets and aspects of the river, and I kind of like learned that the research process there isn't a clear path to like understanding and finding a solution. You just have to kind of like put it together and like understand the bigger scope of things, and like understood that.
Sorry, I saw this hand first.
Yeah, so James with the Space Governance Lab and Hamilton Luger grad myself. So congratulations, made a great choice in the beginning, making even greater choices now with your project. I was wondering if you in your research if you came across any civil society organizations that have made the Ozama River pollution issue an issue within itself, whether that be fishing groups or environmental group advocacy groups in the area.
I mean, I think the civil society groups we looked at were a lot of the ones like trying to address the problem. Like I think ocean cleanup was a big one that we looked at. But it was actually interesting. I read like a news article, and it was actually talking about how the influence of the ocean cleanup was maybe like inhibiting some of the like local fishing practices, or how like there's like like lily pad adjacents in the river, and that was making it a little more difficult for like other industry in the river to continue. But I'd say it's mostly has to do with like the plastic cleanup efforts as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, I guess to add on to that, a lot of the residents who do live near the Ozama River, they do throw their plastic waste into the river, which does contribute to the problem a little bit. And the reason they do that is because there is no plastic waste infrastructure, or like when it comes to education or like funds to even be able to have like a waste management system around the Ozama River. So that does contribute to the problem a little bit.
Eduardo Brondizio here at the workshop. I love the three presentations and the organization that you made. Super cool. So just I love your map too. So don't put your map down. It's a the community.
There's others too.
It communicates very well, I think, the relationship between hydrology, population density, the river. So I really like it. No, my question is whether you guys saw a difference in types of plastics. Because that may influence the source of plastics and the types of problems that creates it. Is that data even available? You know, like, or can you differentiate types of plastic so you can trace different sources potentially?
We did try, like specifically with the question of like macroplastics versus microplastics, we were specifically focusing on macroplastics in the river. When it comes to the different types of plastics themselves, that is a little more nebulous. There is trade data on the plastic inflows and outflows into the Dominican Republic based on the different types of plastics. The type of plastic that we primarily like of all like the categories of plastics or whatever that we were looking at specifically are like the sachet plastics. Primarily because the Dominican Republic is so reliant on this specific like plastic group, I guess, like over reliant on it specifically compared to other countries. And so a lot of that research was narrowed down to that specific type of plastic, but we didn't look much at like the like chemical composition of plastics and like breakdown of those, just because that felt like a little out of the scope of what we were looking at.
Yeah, so the way I got this number is of like 8 to 9% of total waste being macroplastics was in the Dominican Republic. There is data on how much plastic there is. So it's around 12 to 13%. And then I kind of standardized it by looking at like other like sources and seeing like what percent of plastic are macroplastics. And it was around like 67% to like 73% around that range. So then I took that number and like I calculated like an approximation to get to like the 8 to 9% range of like all waste being macroplastics. And it's not like 100% accurate, but that's like I think that's the closest assumption we can get from like what we can derive from like online data. Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but you also did do some interesting research on plastics waste capture, from which we could extrapolate how much was entering the environment because there was no record of it being recovered or sequestered appropriately.
And I'll add, right, to your point about what kinds of plastics, there is not great data. And in some ways, we had to talk a lot about what we can and can't infer. That we have and what we know, especially when we look at Erin's work about how communities behave, what kinds of industries are using what kinds of plastics in this area. So we base this on the idea that this is a sachet economy, so there's going to be lots of packaging plastics, particularly. But you have, right, the Comtrade data does not sort this very well. It's very opaque. But I think we had some really good conversations, and particularly you guys had really, really good ideas about how to think about that challenge of inference.
And this also traces us back to why we looked to broaden the source to sea framework to understand the influx of plastic into these environments. Because honestly, just like the methodologies that people use to measure plastics once they enter rivers are really, really inefficient. Like there'll be things like we stood on a bridge and we counted visible plastics floating in the water and we guessed from there. And it's just like, this is an actual way that people are trying to assess it because it's so complicated to understand, like based on buoyancy, like all of the density, how long has it been in the river, all of these contributing things make it really, really hard at the end to understand how big and how serious the problem is. And so this is why we're doing a lot of inference on like, if this is how much plastic is coming into the country, and this is how much waste infrastructure that they have available to capture it, and this is how effectively they're capturing it, can we extrapolate from there that the rest of this is disposed inappropriately? And then Louis did really great work on helping us understand like flood zones and where plastic waste intrusion into these tributaries might be happening and within the dense urban area as well. And then also there's like really interesting sociocultural stuff about what we were initially talking about when it comes to making your waste invisible. Is that just a mechanism of like, you can't live with that kind of waste, and so they put it directly into the river. And so some of the articles that we were reading is like it's just literally part of the understanding of infrastructure, like environmental infrastructure that disposes of the waste for them, is they will just put like trash bags of waste directly into the river. Because nothing can come to clean it up, especially in these really informal communities that don't have road access and all of that. So yeah. Matthew? Oh, sorry. No, I think, is that okay?
You can go.
Please.
Oh, thanks. I'm Matty. Thank you so much for your great presentation and for very nice slides that you had. Actually, I was wondering, did you have any clue that what are the main process or main drivers of plastic transportation to the river? I mean, is it because of the I don't know, topology of the area, or because of the precipitation or sewage system? Because in this way, if you can, if we can understand what are the main, drivers, the policymakers could devise better interventions. Thank you.
Yeah, so something that was really interesting to find out was just how extreme the amount of plastics being inputted were, like directly almost only a few miles from the coast. So I don't have a map on the slide deck, but basically there was a study that found that like I don't have the percentage right off the top of my head, but a majority of the plastics were actually being inputted into the river, something within like 5 or so miles of the coast. So one of the interesting discoveries for me, at least, was that a lot of the like questions of like topography of the geography of the surrounding area, not that they aren't important, because they absolutely are, but they don't have actually as much of an impact as like the direct inputs of plastic into the river by like the urban area. So we were looking a lot at like major plastic sites in the urban area as well, and like how those interact with flood zones. I talked a little bit about how in a lot of communities, plastic sites are placed strategically near flood zones so that they flood into the river. We were looking a little bit at that, and there we couldn't get to like a 100%. Like, there's no way to like 100% confirm like how this much comes from plastic sites, this much comes from direct inputs, this much comes from these communities that live on the river. But we did our best to, I guess, yeah.
I think to add on to that, I think the biggest driver was just like 15% of the plastic is like unmanaged. So what that means is like a lot of the plastic just like thrown onto the street, and because of like gravity and rainfall, anytime it like storms or rains, because of like gravity, all that plastic waste is then transported into like the Ozama River, and then that's like a cyclical problem as a result of it. But then another component I like previously touched on was that a lot of the riverbank communities next to the river, there's no waste management systems or facilities associated with it. So what they do is they take all the waste that they have and just like dump it in the river.
John?
Yeah, so the plastic pollution is kind of like, on one hand, a phenomenon to describe of like what drives it, how does it work, how much, and the other hand, it's a problem to solve. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts of how you approached it and how that kind of interplay, like describe how it works, try to change how it works by describing how it works and change how it works. Like, it's a bit iterative, but any thoughts on kind of as you went along, did it start very problem focused and you had to step back and describe it, or what were your experiences?
I mean, I feel like right off the bat with that question, I'm thinking about this one like study that we read that said recycling doesn't work. You know what I mean? It's like, I feel like we're so conditioned, at least school in the US, it's like, yeah, you recycle and that's how you like deal with the plastic problem. Like, it's reused and made into other materials. But like grasping the fact that that is not really an option, it's like, wow, we really need to like kind of go back and like actually like look at plastic source or plastic pollution from the source of like how it actually gets into the river basin itself. And I feel like that would be the key goal.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but like the difference between like plastic pollution being caused by behavior and being caused by the systems themselves. That was like a really big like distinction that we like pretty quickly realized, that it's not like the people in Santo Domingo don't care about the river. It's that the systems in place aren't functioning in terms of like a strong waste management infrastructure. So yeah. If I can remove that question.
Do you feel like you got to a place where you could say, you know, if I were in charge, here's what I would do, or like, here's a lever we can pull, policy, economics, recycling, infrastructure, whatever it might be, where you like, I understand how the system works, and here are like the 2 or 3 levers that I think we could, I'm a visual learner, visual talker too, I guess, that we could pull that would have the most effect in this system or on this problem. Do you feel like you got to that point? If you didn't, that's fine. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it's a yes and a no. I think specifically we do have like kind of have a basic understanding of some levers that we can pull, but then we don't really know how to like quantify that and then like go up to like policymakers and people who run the whole system as a whole, like come up to them and say like this is what you should do specifically. But to give you a general idea, I think one lever that it's on like the next slide. I like mentioned that at the bottom. So like the first thing is like aligning incentives. So I previously touched on like law 225-20, and it's like a generic law saying that we need to reduce the number of plastic in the Dominican Republic, but there's been no like incentives and like coordination between the people with like the policymakers within the DR and also the people who work in the DR and just like the whole community as a whole to like create some sort of intervention. So what they could do is that they could create like, you know, they did ban single-use plastics, but then they implement a fine for grocery stores who have single-use plastics within the store. And then as a result, there will be less single-use plastics within the whole economy as a whole. But what I've seen through like my research and different videos is that they've banned single-use plastics, but then nobody's actually enforcing it, which causes the problem to be even bigger. And there's no point of the law even existing in the first place. And then a second lever is just like strengthening enforcement. I kind of talked about this earlier, but just like implementing a system of like fines and like actual infrastructure in place for the, you know, the people to be actually like scared to like, you know, just like throw plastic into like the streets or like throw plastic like wherever they want and not actually recycle and like just like put it in like trash cans or like their appropriate waste management facility. And then the last thing, just like reducing like plastic inflows in general. And all this just comes down to just like more infrastructure as a whole. So just like putting trash cans in like everyone's homes, having more trash cans on the streets, having more infrastructure in public parks and places so that people can know how to like throw away their waste. And just like also like education too, just like informing the general public on like practices of, you know, proper waste management. And then over time, gradually they'll be able to like understand and like the problem, like I guess the problem will is not gonna like completely like be mitigated as a whole, but it's gonna be less and less prevalent.
We are,
Response.
yeah. We are